Hey guys, welcome to Social Studies. Your learning target today is I understand the difference between an empire and a civilization, right? So we're talking about this a little bit more. We're beginning chapter 4, getting into some more empires and learning about more cultures. It's going to be very, very fascinating. But to start, we're thinking about this idea of how people are kind of growing in cities and becoming more civilized, quote unquote. And different empires are conquering huge regions of land compared to the smaller city states. So, throwing it back to yesterday with Mrs. Dana Jealous, let's look at our question for the day. So, we asked you yesterday, what do you think about the idea that humans have maybe passed their prime? And someone asked me in class, what does prime mean? And well, that means like their peak or the very best that they can be. So we know that when humans were hunters and gatherers, they knew how to do everything to survive: make clothing, find food, build houses, um, pretty much make any tool that they needed. So it was a more well rounded situation. And like Mrs. D'Angelo said, as cities grew, people became more specialized and they only knew one little specific part of the city. They knew one job of the city, and then we depend on other people to provide us with other things. So, for example, like a computer. I could never build a computer, right? I could never write a website or fix a website if it was down. We use computers all the time. Well, people like Sam or like Mrs. Jablonski has been teaching us about coding. They know how to fix websites. They know how to build programs and write code. And I know how to teach in a middle school, but I don't know how to write code. If my house has a leak, I don't know how to fix the pipes. I have to call my plumber and say, "Hey, can you come help me? I've got a huge leak. Everything's ruined." Right? I don't know how to fix the leak. I don't know how to do plumbing. So there's these little things that we all have a niche for. We all are good at our jobs. Does it matter that we've changed like this? What do you think? Do you think humans were better off more well-rounded as everyone was kind of doing everything as hunters and gatherers? Or is it better to have the specialization of jobs? So, what do you think? Do you answer the question down at the bottom and then we'll move on? Go ahead and just have a discussion in your class too if different people have different opinions. Great. So you've answered your question. We're jumping now to chapter 4, empires. Okay. We are in 4.2 today. So I would like everyone to get out your online textbook, which looks like this. So it's posted in your chapter 4 folder in classwork. So go to Google Classroom, get out chapter 4. The textbook is posted there. You should have section 2 pulled up, which is immediately following section 1. And your teacher also was given a handout for you to have in front of you with a pen or a pencil. So once you have your handout, your pen and pencil, and section 2 pulled up on your screen, go ahead and continue the video. All right, great. Let me show you what the handout looks like. Section 2, characteristics of empires. So let's briefly skim through this so you know what you are looking for as we go through the chapter together. So remember, we are in era 3, and first we're going to look at characteristic number 1 of an empire. So the first characteristic of empire is it's blank. So we're going to be figuring that out as we read. And then you have a true or false here. The Roman Empire was approximately 18 times larger than Michigan? Question mark? We'll figure it out. Then jump to characteristic number 2, and we'll fill in what that one was. We have another true and false. The Han Dynasty slash Emperor had 8 times more people than Michigan. I don't know. Maybe you have an idea. Characters number 3, we will fill in this blank here. Where did people who live in regions? And how is this different from city states? We'll answer that. Empires of this age began to pull new people and places under their control. Some use force while others what? And then lastly, governing empires. Empires of this age were characterized by 2 different forms of government systems. We'll figure what that is. And majority of empires of this age were controlled by a single ruler called a what? Or a group of rulers called what? Okay. And lastly, the rulers had blank power and attempted to control all aspects of life. So we'll figure out what that meant. And then there's a few more here. An example of a ruler who converted his entire empire to a new religion. We'll figure out who that was. And then some absolute rulers used two different things by means to control and rule their empires. And then lastly, two ways legal codes and communication were important to an empire. There's two things to list there. At the bottom, you see you have definitions, and that will help you as we are reading along. Okay? So that should be in front of you. Let's jump over to chapter 4. So to start off, I'm going to begin by reading this top paragraph up here, and then I'm going to pass it over to you. So let's start. Empires were one of the most important forces of Era 3. Empires changed and shaped the world and began to draw people more closely together. But what are the characteristics of an empire? How do we know when an empire has developed? These are just two of the questions to explore when studying world history. So now what I'd like you to do is I need one volunteer to go ahead and read this next paragraph right next to the map. So go ahead and pause the video and have someone read this next paragraph out loud to the class. Great, thank you. So the first characteristic of an empire is its large size. Let's look at a comparison here. So the Roman Empire, which is featured here in this picture, this is the greatest extent of the Roman Empire. So a little bit after zero, so about 117 AD. So thousands to a million square miles, right? The Roman Empire, 1.69 million square miles. The Achaemenid Empire, 3.29 million square miles. So in comparison, the United States is 3.8 million square miles. So the second one there is about the size of the United States. It covers a lot of distance. To compare even more, the state of Michigan, only 96,716 square miles. Okay, so these are very, very big areas compared to what we've studied with civilizations and city states. These expanded across a lot of different terrain, different geographic features, bodies of water. You can see with the Roman Empire here, it surrounds completely the Mediterranean Sea. Okay. Now let's jump back to your notes here. So, characteristic number 1, empires were one of the most important forces of Era 3. Okay. The first characteristic of an empire is its what? Large size, right? We just read that in the large size. We just read that in the chapter. And true or false, the Roman Empire was approximately 18 times larger than Michigan. Well, if you do the math, 96,000 to 1.69 million, that is true. That is 18 times larger than Michigan. All right. So we just did that first box together. As we continue reading through the chapter, you are going to continue on and do characteristic 2, characteristic 3, governing empires. And then at the very end, let's go over the answers together with the answer key. Okay. But you can go ahead and fill these in as we go if you find the correct word to fill in those blanks. Awesome. So you should have characteristic 1 all set. We're jumping to characteristic 2. So if you scroll down in your chapter, all right, and can I have a new person now? Go ahead and pause the video, and I'd like you to read from there to there. So what I have highlighted here. So go ahead, pause the video, and go ahead and read that next paragraph, whoever is volunteering in your class. Thank you. Great. So let's talk about the second characteristic, large populations. So there were very large populations at this time. These were empires, right? Not just civilizations. They were empires, large, think big scale. Roman Empire, 50 to 100 million. The Han Dynasty, dynasty is another word for empire, by the way. 57 million. Okay, to compare, the United States has approximately 300 million people that live in its borders. Okay, so quite a bit bigger in comparison, but Michigan only has 9 million. So still a very, very large group of people for one government to be in control of, right? And remember, this wasn't just a bunch of basically the same people with very similar worldviews and beliefs like the United States. These were very, very different cultures that were brought together under one government, and a lot of them had different um, lifestyles, religions. They lived in completely different areas, right? They spoke way different languages. Okay. So empires really brought a lot of people together for the first time in known history. Okay. So let's jump to the third. So that was the second one, large populations. All right, so go ahead and pause the video and a third person now, whoever is so bold, can read this paragraph right here. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video and then we'll talk about this map. Great, thank you. Now let's jump over to the third characteristic, the main points here. So the third characteristic, it's not really cut and dry, but basically it's ruling over regions and people who live far away from central government. So it's this idea that the central government, it's central, right? That's the center of the entire empire. It's only in one location. The king, the rulers, whoever it is, they can't be a million places at once, right? They're just in the center of the region, the empire. But they're ruling over people that were very, very far away, and this had not happened before, okay? So let's revisit first that word we talked about yesterday, universal. The definition of universal is including, relating to, or affecting all members of the class or group under consideration, applicable in all cases. So you can think of universal as something that includes or embodies everything. So the universe, right? So that's kind of a big, you know, that's everything. So it's the same thing. Universal is a smaller scale, it's everything that's included. So when we're talking about universal government, that's when we're talking about a government that applies to all people, no matter what they look like, what they are, what they believe in, where they're from. So government was in the center of the empire but ruled over people across the entire region. Some empires forced new subjects they conquered to adapt, while others allowed them to continue on with their lives. Okay, we'll look into some different examples for both of those, and you'll see what was successful, what wasn't. There's pros and cons for both. Other things to note here. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So if we jump back to the interactive 4.1, I forgot to touch on this during characters number 2. We're talking about size, but if you click on this interactive, it'll take you to this page right here, and you can actually see how many Michigans fit in the Han Dynasty alone. Remember, the Han Dynasty is China, and very, very fascinating. We'll learn about the Great Wall, we'll learn about the Silk Road. These are all major accomplishments of China, but you can see you can fit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 Michigans into this entire empire. Just a fun little exercise. This textbook is really good about making things interactive. So, moving on, we're jumping to the third characteristic again. People didn't live in city states anymore where there was a local government. They were ruled by the king or the empire. So let's learn about what kind of governments that looked like, okay? And this last paragraph I will read. Finally, the empires of this age were characterized by monarchy and oligarchy government systems. The majority of these empires were controlled by a single ruler called a king or emperor, or a group of rulers called oligarchs. Hint, hint, you might want to look at your 4.2 notes for these. In either case, the ruler or rulers held total and absolute power over their territory and attempted to control all aspects of the lives of the people living within their borders. Whatever belief system the emperors held, so did those the people they ruled. Famous example of this, a famous example of this is when Constantine converted not only himself, but the entire Roman Empire to Catholicism before his death. You will read more about this in a later chapter. These absolute rulers used legal codes and communication as the means by which they ruled their empires. Language and forms of communication were useful in tying together groups of people within the empire who may have little else in common. Systems of law provided people of all different backgrounds with a set of rules and expectations that would be accepted and, there's that word, universal across the empire. All right, and that is the end of 4.2. So let's jump back to our slides here. The other main points here are there's monarchy and oligarchy government systems. These both have total and absolute power over the people living within the empire, but there's a difference. The monarch is when it's a single ruler, like a king or an emperor, a queen, as we saw in Egypt. When you guys did your study on Egypt, a lot of you talked about how there was really powerful queens that ruled. Oligarchs are a group of rulers, okay? So, what that looks like today could be in England, they have parliament, which is a group of people that make the decisions. In the United States, we have Congress that makes decisions. The United States has a president too, and they have the executive branch. So, there's a lot of different factors for the United States. You'll learn about that next year in 8th grade, which will be awesome. But, anyways, oligarchs are a group. But the benefit here is people from all different backgrounds were provided with a set of expectations and rules that would be accepted across an entire empire. And that actually was really efficient. If you think about it in your classrooms, if there's no rules or if the rules change frequently or they don't exactly make sense with each other, it's really difficult to know what am I supposed to do. The same thing happens if you're given instructions that are confusing. Like maybe that's happened in social studies or another classroom before where this doesn't really add up. It gets confusing. But if things are very clear, the expectations are very clear, the rules are consistent, you know exactly what you're going to get in trouble for every day, you know exactly what you're going to get rewarded for every day, it's easier to be successful. So that's something to keep in mind. That applies to government as well. All right, go ahead and flip back to your 4.2 notes to the top. We're going to go over these together and you're going to get the answers now, okay? So make sure you are ready to get the answers. All right, now I'm not typing, but you may or may not need to pause because everything is already filled in. And we're going to roll right through it. You should have something down for most of these. So characteristic number 2, the second characteristic of empires was their large populations. And it is true, the Han Dynasty had 8 times more people than Michigan. Remember, we filled in that Michigan. Characteristic number 3, the third characteristic of empires was the fact that they ruled over regions of people who lived far away from where the government was centered. How is this different from city states? They were usually under the local control of their individual leaders. Not so anymore. There's just one main honcho now. Empires of this age began to pull new people and places under their control. Some used force, while others, what? Others allowed them to continue their lives as normal. Governing empires. The empires of this age were characterized by monarchy and oligarchy government systems. The majority of empires of this age were controlled by a single ruler called a king or emperor, or a group of rulers called oligarchs. Okay? The rulers had total and absolute power and attempted to control all aspects of life, whatever belief systems the leaders held, so did those of the people they ruled. Give an example of a ruler who converted his entire empire to a new religion: Constantine. And the last one, this is probably one of the trickiest ones. These absolute rulers used legal codes and communication as the means by which they ruled their empires. Common sense, right? You got to communicate. List two ways legal codes or laws and communication were important to an empire. Number one, tying together groups of people with little in common. Number two, provided rules and expectations. Okay. These empires really set the tone for how a lot of countries built their governments. I know for the United States, the founding fathers looked at the Roman Empire for a lot of different ideas and beliefs on how to be successful in a nation they knew was going to be very diverse and have a lot of different people that they had to kind of bring together, right? After they separated from England. So they looked at empires like the Roman Empire, these other empires, the Han Dynasty. Okay. It was really important how they set these things up. It was ingenious. Okay. There's also flaws. We'll learn about all of it. All right, and that's it for your 4.2. So at this time, go ahead and answer your reflection question. If you have any questions for Mrs. D'Angelis or myself, now is a good time to email us. If you're checking your grades and you notice a few flaws, go ahead and do that now. I am almost finished with, I can speak for myself, I'm almost finished with your Egypt projects. And Mrs. D'Angelis, I think, is completed hers. So make sure those are correct. And we will see you again tomorrow. So thanks for a great class period, guys, and have a good rest of your Tuesday.